Hi, friends. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the fourth session of our Times of Crisis and Possibility series, exploring pivotal moments in the Jewish experience with JTS faculty and fellows. Welcome back if you've joined us before, and special welcome if this is your first time. Today's session is called What Should an Educated Jew Know? When and Why This Question Emerged in the 18th Century and Continues to Confound Us, with Dr. Jack Wertheimer. So we're pivoting to a completely different type of moment of crisis and possibility, and we're going to be doing that several other sessions in this series as well. Not necessarily a time of complete societal collapse, some of the other moments that we've looked at, but all different levels and natures of crises and pressing communal questions. I wanted to let you know also we have added a new session to the series since we've gotten such a positive response. So we'll send you an email about it, but just so you can mark your calendars, on Monday, June 15th, same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, our JTS fellow, Dr. Edna Friedberg, who is just outstanding. She will be teaching on literature as lifeline. What were Jews reading and writing in the ghettos? About how reading and writing offered a form of spiritual sustenance to communities under siege. I would highly recommend joining us for that, but we'll send you an email about it. Okay, now on to today's session. So just a few announcements and technical instructions. First of all, I want to thank our community engagement team who is working on this series, in particular Rabbi Tim Bernard, who's going to be facilitating a Q&A, as well as Stacy Firestone and Tani Schwartz-Herman, and of course our faculty I'll introduce in a moment. Excuse me. So if you are not a Zoom pro already from all your Zoom use over the last 2 months, just want to make sure you know a couple of specific things. So first of all, on the top right, if you're in gallery view, meaning you see a whole array of all of us, all of your fellow adult learners, feel free to switch to speaker view, which will allow you to see Professor Wertheimer close up, dominating your screen, and likewise when someone else is asking a question, you'll see their face and you don't need to hunt through all those beautiful faces in the gallery. Speaking of questions, Dr. Wertheimer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we'll also have a Q&A period at the end. We use the raise hand feature in Zoom. So to raise your hand, you want to click on your bottom toolbar where it says participants, click on that, and then you'll, in the panel that opens up, see a little hand icon. So to raise your hand, click that icon. To lower your hand, click it again. Feel free to test it out now if you'd like. And Tim will call on individuals and unmute you when it's your turn. So once he calls on you, then you'll know that you've been unmuted. And if you're participating today by phone, you can raise your hand by dialing *9, and again *9 to lower your hand. If I'm actually not sure if Professor Wertheimer is doing any screen sharing, but if he does, then you will, another little tab on the top will appear of the shared screen that says View Options, and you'll see a vertical, you can adjust your view in different ways. If you've been on gallery, you can see Professor Wertheimer close up by switching to speaker, and you can also move that vertical line back and forth. So if you'd like to see the shared screen smaller and Dr. Wertheimer bigger, or vice versa, you have that flexibility. Okay, I think that those are all the technical announcements. Hopefully you got the sources and the email that you received today containing the Zoom link today, and I believe that Stacy also posted them in the chat. So now it's finally my great pleasure to introduce Professor Wertheimer, who is the Joseph and Martha Mendelson Professor of American Jewish History at JTS. His area of specialization, as you probably know, is modern Jewish history, with a focus on trends in the religious, educational, and organizational sectors of American Jewish life since World War II. He is the author or editor of more than a dozen volumes, including Unwelcome Strangers, East European Jews in Imperial Germany, The American Synagogue, A Sanctuary Transformed, and The Modern Jewish Experience, A Reader's Guide. He also wrote A People Divided, Judaism in Contemporary America, which won a National Jewish Book Award for the best study on contemporary Jewish life. And even closer to home, he has edited a 2-volume history of JTS entitled Tradition Renewed, gathering commissioned essays by 40 scholars. And he also coordinated a major sociological study of conservative synagogues under a grant from the Pew Charitable Trusts. And most recently, as you may know also, he's written a number of studies about the rapidly evolving field of Jewish education. Finally, Dr. Wertheimer served as provost, the chief academic officer of JTS from 1997 to 2007, and also as the founding director of JTS's Joseph and Miriam Ratner Center for the Study of Conservative Judaism from 1980 to 2008. And Professor Wertheimer, you were one of the first to volunteer when we put out a call to faculty to teach in this new series. So thank you so much for your generosity and your expertise, and thanks for teaching us today.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. I'm delighted to be here with everybody today. And I'm particularly grateful to my home institution, JTS, for giving us all the opportunity to spend some time together learning, and rather than focusing on some of the tough news that constantly bombards us. I should add, and Rabbi Andelman already noted this, that my topic has nothing to do with plague, has nothing to do with virus, but it rather focuses on some very other types of things. We will be focusing today on a single document, excerpts from a pamphlet that was published in 1782 by a Jew by the name of Naftali Hertz Weisel. I'll tell you more about him in a little while. The name of the pamphlet that he wrote is translated in English as Words of Peace and Truth. It was written in Hebrew. Its Hebrew title is Divrei Shalom Ve'emet. And the reason that we're going to be spending time talking about it today is because, as I hope to show you, this pamphlet represents a very dramatic change in the relationship of Jews with the wider societies in which they lived, and it has some implications for us to the present day. Just a word about how I'd like us to spend our time today. I'm dividing my presentation into 3 parts. The first and the longest will consist of an orientation to the Jewish situation when the pamphlet was written, meaning in the late 18th century. And then we're going to be spending time, I will be sharing my screen with you, so we'll be spending some time reading some portions of this document together and analyzing what Naftali Hertz Weisel was saying in the document, let alone why I think it's an important document for us. I'll then take your questions, and then the next section will consist of a discussion of the wider Jewish context of the time, specifically of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement. Haskalah comes from, as the same root as seichel, intelligence. I'm getting notices, by the way, that the sound is very low. Should I turn mine up? Any suggestions?
The sound sounds okay for me.
Okay.
So it might be Bill's local settings.
Okay, then I'll just continue. And after I speak about the second section, I'll be taking your questions. And finally, the third part will bring us into the present day and offer an opportunity to reflect a little bit about how this continues to have resonance, and the issues that are raised here continue to have resonance to the present day. So those are the 3 parts. That's the overview of what I'd like to accomplish with you. Let me begin by transporting all of us back to the last quarter of the 18th century. The French Revolution has not yet occurred, because we're talking about the year 1782, nor has the American Constitution been written, let alone ratified as yet. And we're focusing specifically on Jews in Central Europe. That takes in Jews in German-speaking areas of Central Europe, but not exclusively, because Central Europe also includes what then was called the Habsburg Empire, which took in Austria and Hungary and Moravia and Bohemia, as well as large chunks, actually, of Italy. And we'll talk more about that situation in a moment, but focusing on the condition of the Jews, they primarily still had many disabilities, medieval disabilities, in the form of restrictions that were placed on them. There were restrictions placed upon the occupations that Jews could hold. Jews were not permitted to own land. They were not allowed to engage in agricultural work. They couldn't become artisans because they were not permitted to join guilds. What did Jews primarily do during this period of time in Central Europe? That's our focus. They were primarily involved as small traders, small scale traders, that is. They were money lenders. These are typical medieval Jewish occupations. And if you'll pardon my language, they were schmata dealers. They dealt with used rags and they recycled them into clothing. Some things don't change to the present day, do they? There were restrictions on where Jews could live. There were restrictions on what they could own. And so they lived in a largely medieval situation still, as late as 1782. I don't want to paint an entirely static picture for you, though. And I'd like you to be aware that in this period of time, and that's important for our context, discussions were held across Europe, in European governmental circles and intellectual circles as well, about the need to reorganize society. And that also meant a reorganization or rethinking of the way in which Jews were to be treated. This occurred in part because states wanted to develop themselves more rationally, to order society more rationally, and also this developed because of the spreading ideas of Enlightenment thinkers who were also interested in the reorganization and reordering of societies. What do we know about the Jews in this period of time? They tended to be Yiddish speakers. They had not yet learned the vernacular, although there were exceptions. There were Jewish intellectuals, there were business people who did speak the vernacular, primarily German in this particular case. But again, I want to stress that they lived with many restrictions. There was no concept yet of citizenship. That's a concept that emerged only during the French Revolution, and there was no concept yet of legal equality between all people. That is the broader context then. Now to zero in. During this period of time from the 1740s to the 1780s, just in the decades just before the document on which we will focus, during that period of time, there were debates that were held about other groups in society and how they ought to be treated. So that, for example, Catholic countries were debating how Protestants ought to be treated. Remember, our focus is on the Habsburg Empire, and the Habsburg Empire was largely a Catholic empire, and so the question arose as to how Protestants would be treated. So this was not only Jews who were the subject of discussion. The governments were concerned about rationalizing the power of the state, including improving tax collection. And as I noted already, they were inspired by the Enlightenment ideas about the perfectibility of society and the virtues of reforms. So I'd like to outline for you now what some of those who were talking about Jews and writing about Jews were saying at the time. And I'm going to ask your forgiveness if what I say now sounds highly simplified, but there's more truth to what I'm going to say than not. There were essentially three positions that were staked out during these debates that non-Jews, government officials especially, were having about what to do with our Jews during this period of time. And I want you to think, as I lay out these three positions, whether there were any commonalities.
Yeah,
if you don't find them, then I'm really in trouble.
Sit down, okay?
So, first of all, what about what was being said about the Jews? There was one group that said, look, we live in Christian societies, and until the Jews cease being Christians, then we can't even contemplate changing their condition. The Jews of today, we acknowledge, are rotten. They are backward. They are superstitious. They stink. It was believed that literally the Jews had a distinctive odor. And until the Jews become Christians, there's really nothing we're going to do to change their status. That was group number one. Group number two said the following: the Jews of our time stink. They are backward. They are superstitious. They don't fit well into society. But, and here's how they differed, the second group. But the burden of proof is on the Jews to demonstrate to us that they're capable of changing their disgusting ways. If they can demonstrate that to us, then we should contemplate improving their condition and giving them a higher status, treating them better, in other words. Here comes group number three. Let's see if you can catch the similarity between these groups. Group number three said, the Jews of our day stink. They are backward. They are superstitious. They're disgusting. But, said group number three, is it any wonder that they are this way, given how poorly we have treated the Jews over so many hundreds of years? We, Christians, we, the governments, are at fault for having treated them this way. In 1781, the year before our pamphlet, a Prussian government official by the name of Christian Wilhelm Dohm, D-O-H-M, wrote a pamphlet entitled Concerning the Amelioration of the Civil Status of the Jews, in which he argued for improving our treatment, government treatment of the Jews. And he said explicitly, yes, the Jews are backward, but it's our fault. If we improve the way in which, or change the way in which we treat these Jews, raise their status, alter the restrictions, lift the restrictions rather, then you'll see the Jews are going to change their ways and they will become like us. They'll join in to our societies. Now, I hope I don't have to tell you that the common denominator running through these three different points of view was an agreement that the Jews, the Ashkenazic Jews of Europe, as they were in that period of time, were regarded as disgusting people, outsiders, pariahs in a social sense. And the only question was, is there anything to be done about it? So along now comes our time period, and I want to zero in on a set of documents that are kind of lumped together under the heading of the Edict of Toleration, the Toleranzpatent, as they said in German. This was issued in 1781 and 1782. I said it was a series of documents issued by the emperor of the Habsburg Empire, which I mentioned before took in Austria and Hungary and Bohemia, Moravia, and large chunks of Italy too. And Joseph II, the emperor, issued these decrees in part, or initially rather, in order to change the status of Protestants living in the Habsburg Empire. And then he got around to dealing separately with the Jews. And he took a kind of carrot and stick approach to the Jews, as one historian labeled it. What do I mean by that? To some extent, he lifted restrictions, medieval restrictions upon the Jews. But on the other hand, he left many still in place in this Edict of Toleration. I want to just read to you, it's only a few lines, 3 lines, what he stated as his goal for this Edict of Toleration. I'm quoting now, "It is our purpose to make the Jews more useful and serviceable to the state, principally through according their children better instruction and enlightenment, and by employing them in the sciences, arts, and handicrafts." So I want to just underscore the first words. What does he aim to do? To make the Jews more useful and serviceable to the state. This is not an altruistic document. This is not a lover of the Jews who decides, you know, we haven't treated them well enough and I want to be a good guy. No, he wants to change their status in a way that will integrate them more into the society and especially into the economy. So what did this Edict of Toleration state? Well, it stated, for example, on the side of improvement in the condition of Jews, that Jews may own land, that they may become artisans. These were positive steps. What he didn't say was that the guilds would be required to admit the Jews as artisans. He didn't require people to sell land to the Jews. So what I'm trying to paint here for you is a complex document that did open up opportunities for Jews, but at the same time offered restrictions. It was a document that also, as I just noted from what I read, paid attention to the language of the Jews as well as the education of Jews. He required Jewish business people now to keep their financial records in German, not in Yiddish or Hebrew. He required children to attend schools where the German language would be taught, either in schools for non-Jews, and there was no guarantee that they would admit Jewish children, or in Jewish schools that now had to teach the German language. And yet there were also many restrictions that he left in place on the numbers of families that could live in certain parts of this empire, where Jews could reside, how immigrants would be treated. In Vienna, for example, he forbade the establishment of a synagogue or any kind of public worship. I'm stressing this point because as I read this document, and others do as well, it was a mixed picture. But certainly what it did suggest was that times were changing. Something was in the air, some sense that the status of the Jews was changing and could further change. This brings us now to our hero of the day, a man by the name of Naftali Herz Wiesel. In English, for some strange reason, it's spelled Wesley, but his name was Wiesel, very similar to Elie Wiesel, but in this case, it's W-E-I-S-E-L. He was born, he was a German Jew. He was born and died in Hamburg. He was born to a merchant family of some means. He traveled around Europe. He traveled to Amsterdam, Copenhagen. He spent considerable time in Berlin, which was the center of the German Haskalah movement. He wrote quite a number of books and pamphlets, all of which he wrote in the Hebrew language. In fact, historians of modern Hebrew literature, some, actually have noted that Naftali Herz Wiesel his writings represented the beginning of modern Hebrew literature. So stated Joseph Klausner, amongst others, a leading student of Jewish literature, modern Jewish literature particularly. I want to mention one particular book that Wiesel wrote, and that was a commentary on a book of the Mishnah, known to all of us, the Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, and he wrote a traditional commentary on that. And I want you to bear this in mind because we have to think about, well, how radical was this guy and how traditional was this guy? Well, now we come to our document. Naftali Herz Wiesel seized, by the way, I'm going to be sharing my screen with you now, so just bear with me one moment. Okay. Here it is. Okay, this is the middle of a document. We're going to go over different parts of it. So Naftali Herz Wiesel seized upon Joseph II's Edict of Toleration. And I'm beginning from the end of the document because that's where he refers to it, and then we'll make our way to the beginning of the document. He talks about how there are certain turning points in history where under God's guidance, and I read to you over here, can you follow my, my cursor over here? The left-hand column where it says, however. However, it was not as man envisioned, for to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under the heaven, which of course is a famous biblical quotation from Ecclesiastes. From the time the Creator, blessed be He, established heaven and earth, He ordered in His superior wisdom the appointed times of the universe, times of good and times of evil, for He proclaims the generations from the beginning and sees to the end of all existence. And then he goes on to talk about how God inspired people. He revealed to wise men about the arts and the sciences and crafts, even the discovery of America, the inventions of printing, gunpowder, spectacles, and so forth. These were all God-inspired human actions. And then he turns, in the right-hand column now, to his own times. And he writes as follows. This is what's most pertinent to us. O generation, you who have seen that God is good, He has raised up a great man, a savior to mankind, the exalted emperor, His Majesty Joseph II. Aside from the tidings of his wisdom, his counsel, and his military might, imperial statements that have recently issued from him have brought us tidings of even more heroic deeds. These statements, words of peace and truth to all his subjects, have been tried in the crucible of reason and are founded on the love of mankind. Joseph II is my hero, he's saying. This guy, he loves humanity. And not only that, he's a man who's motivated by reason. Remember, this is the age of the Enlightenment. I should say to you that when I do go over this document with students at JTS, I inquire whether they recognize these words, the quotation, words of peace and truth, divrei shalom ve'emet. This is a direct quotation from the scroll of Esther, which we read on Purim, and that too refers to a king with the assistance of Mordechai and Esther, who send out documents all through the empire, the Persian Empire in that case, announcing good tidings. Well, here we have the same thing. He's building upon that through this biblical allusion. And then he goes on to say the following: moreover, in his many good works, he, again, Joseph II, has not forgotten a poor people long abused, the Jews. He gave us many good and consoling commands, as a father does to his son, a teacher to his pupils, and a benign ruler to his people. He has unshackled the disabling bonds by permitting the Jews to engage in all forms of cultivation of the land, to work in all crafts, and to trade in all merchandise. In his interest, he has also observed that few among us speak the German language accurately. And as a result, I'm scrolling down now, and as a result, cannot read books, neither history books, nor books on etiquette, science, and the arts. Neither can we speak in a clear fashion with the inhabitants of the land and their ministers. Taking this into consideration, he has commanded us upon a righteous path. He has instructed the Jews to establish schools in which to teach their children to read and write the German language. And he's also instructed them to write edifying books according to the Torah, to teach the children understanding and the rules of behavior in society. I'm going to stop here. Many of you have received this document, and you're certainly welcome to read the entire document on your own, but our time is limited. So I want to zero in now on what's the crucial part of this, and bear with me as I just scroll to the beginning of this document. It begins right here, as you can see, but I'm actually going to start one paragraph from the beginning. And this is where he launches into a discussion of the key issue for him, and that is Jewish education. What does it mean to be an educated Jew? How are we to educate our children today? That is his preoccupation. Now, I'm reading over here on the left-hand side. Now, in order to educate the youths of Israel in the proper manner, two types of studies should be established. The first type is the study of human knowledge, which he calls Torat Ha'adam, the Torah of humanity, if you will, human knowledge. That is, those matters which earn for their possessors the title man. This is a very gender document, you will note, since he who lacks this knowledge hardly deserves this title, as shall be explained. The second type is the study of the Torah of God. That is God's laws and teachings, matters that are above human reason and that were made known to Moses through prophetic revelation. Had the Torah not come to us in this divine fashion, it would have remained hidden from even the most sagacious of men, for its contents cannot be deduced from the fixed laws of nature. Moreover, only the seed of Israel is obligated by the laws of the Torah. Now, I just want to recap this. He talks about two different types of knowledge. There is what we would call Jewish studies, but with in his case, a religious emphasis, right? Torah, all right, the special teachings and the resonance of the word Torah, of course. And then there is the teachings of humanity. We'll see what that means also. And both of these exist, but they're separate. And he emphasizes that he's a traditional Jew. He tells us that the Torah of God only became available to the Jewish people through divine revelation. Whereas the Torah of humanity is something that human beings deduced from nature and using their own rationality, their own minds, they arrived at an understanding. So these are two very different disciplines, two very different ways of understanding the world. The question is, what's the relationship between these two different ways of learning? And most importantly, what's the relationship in educational settings, Jewish educational settings, of Torat Hashem and Torat Ha'adam? In general, I'm continuing now. In general, human knowledge is comprised of etiquette, the ways of morality and good character, civility and clear, graceful expression. These matters and their like are implanted in man's reason. He who possesses human knowledge will gain much from the poetic expression of the divine Torah and from the ways of God that are written therein. Now, this is an old argument amongst Jews as to the extent to which they should learn from their neighbors. There is a strong rabbinic tradition of disdain for what they called chokhmat hagoyim, the wisdom of the Gentiles, dangerous, misguided. But he's not saying that. He's saying something different, which certainly some Jewish, educated Jews certainly agreed with in earlier periods of time. And that is, no, there are things to be learned from the wisdom of the Gentiles, so much so that they can even help us to appreciate the Torah better. So that if we learn geometry, we can better understand how to build a sukkah. If we learn astronomy, we can better understand how to calendrate, how to organize the Jewish calendar. So, in other words, we as Jews, religious Jews, can benefit from this knowledge. And that's what he's arguing here. But he goes further than that. But before we get to the further part, let's see what he really means by human knowledge. Similarly, history, geography, astronomy, and the like, which are inscribed in the mind of man as innate primary ideas whose foundation is reason, produce truths in every matter of wisdom. Included in this category of knowledge are the natural sciences, which provide genuine knowledge about all things, animals, plants, minerals, the elements, meteorology, botany, anatomy. He was in love, intoxicated by science, as we'll see was true of the Maskilim in general. It is in man's power to study all of these phenomena by means of his senses and reason. He does not need anything divine to comprehend it, right? So that's that category. The category of human knowledge And that exists separately, and that is something that human beings have apprehended using their intelligence. Now, here comes the crucial paragraph. We're almost done with reading. Now, human knowledge is anterior to the exalted divine laws. What does anterior mean? It comes before, right? We speak in American history about the antebellum period of American history. And what does that refer to? The period before the Civil War. So human knowledge comes before the exalted divine laws. Hence, it is proper that in his youth man should crown himself with the fear of God, but then with the rules of etiquette and with knowledge to which the appellation human is appropriate. With this knowledge, he will prepare his heart to learn the laws and teachings of God. So the first thing that young Jews should learn about is human knowledge, Torah Adam. That will benefit them when they engage in Torah Hashem, God's Torah. Okay? Now I'm going to be skipping a bit. And he writes as follows. This human knowledge benefits the commonweal, as it teaches how to avail oneself of all things under the sun. It is responsible for man's success in all his worldly endeavors and provides a means for every man to be an aid to his fellow through his affairs and actions. Therefore, he who lacks human knowledge, even though he has learned the laws and teachings of God and lives according to them, gives no pleasure to others, and this for two reasons. First, his fellowship is burdensome to other people. He will constantly err in the manners of men. His speech in worldly affairs will not be in conformity with reason, and his actions worse than useless, for they will be of no benefit and no service to other people. And second, even though the laws and teachings of God are far superior to human knowledge, remember that, far superior, he says, about Torah Hashem, they are closely correlated, that is human knowledge, to it. Where human knowledge ends, the divine teaching begins, instructing us on what is beyond man's power of reason. Catch this now. These are the final sentences that we'll read, that is. Therefore, he who is ignorant of the laws of God, but is versed in human knowledge, even though the sages of Israel will not benefit from his light in the study of Torah, he will benefit the remainder of humanity. But he who is ignorant of human knowledge, though he knows the laws of God, gladdens neither the wise of his own people nor the remainder of humanity. We're going to come back in a moment to these last sentences, which are the pivot here. But before we get to that pivot, I want to just make a cynical remark. I'll call it an analytical remark. When he talks about human knowledge, you think he's talking about Chinese culture? When he talks about learning languages, do you think he's talking about learning Swahili? He has defined human knowledge in a very narrow way. What he's talking about is Western knowledge, Western culture. And the reality is that that's what Jews in Europe did. They hitched their wagon to Western culture and Western ways of thinking. And it's in this period of time that that takes place. This is not only on Naftali Hurwitz Weisel, but this was what the Haskalah endeavored to do, to Westernize the Jews, to absorb Western culture. Now, I promised you that we would come back to these sentences over here, because let's understand that this document, yes, it does talk about Jewish education, and it introduces certainly the importance of young Jews being exposed to general knowledge. That Jewish children should be exposed to mathematics and to the sciences and to Western languages and to etiquette, how you eat your food properly, how to cut your food properly. This is all part of Western etiquette that he wanted the Jews to be exposed to. But the document goes beyond that. And it introduces an element here which actually represented an earthquake. Sorry to magnify or exaggerate, but it does, in my view. I'll read the sentences again. Therefore, he who is ignorant of the laws of God, but is versed in human knowledge, even though the sages of Israel will not benefit from his light in the study of Torah, he will benefit the remainder of humanity. But he who is ignorant of human knowledge, though he knows the laws of God, gladdens neither the wise of his own people nor the remainder of humanity. In other words, it's not good enough for Naftali Hertz Weisel that you have Jews who are Talmidei Chachamim, who are scholars, knowledgeable in Jewish knowledge, fluent in Jewish texts. That's very nice, he says, but you know what? They're not going to gladden their own people nor the remainder of humanity. So why do I suggest to you that this represents a major turning point in Jewish history? Because, in my view and my understanding, never before had this become a priority for Jews. What is he saying here? That it's important for the Jews to benefit the remainder of humanity. Since when was that a priority for the Jews? Now, it's one thing to say, and there are certainly rabbinic quotations about this, that we have a responsibility for the welfare of our city. But that's different from benefiting the remainder of humanity. And that becomes a goal of the Haskalah, to ensure that Jews will benefit humanity. And it circles right back to our friend Joseph II, who wrote in the Edict of Toleration, I'll remind you one more time, what did he write? Our purpose is to make the Jews more useful and serviceable to the state. And Naftali Hertz Weisel broadened this out, not only useful to the state, but useful to the neighbors of the Jews. Now, last point, and then we're going to break for some questions. How did other Jews of the time respond to this? Well, the Maskilim, that is the Jewish Enlightenment figures, they were very pleased with this document. But traditional rabbis were very unhappy with this. And I just want to read with you the beginnings of a response written by such a traditional rabbi, a Polish rabbi by the name of David Ben Nathan of Lisa, who responded to our good friend Naftali Hertz Weisel, and it didn't appear in 1918, but he responded at the time, and this is what he wrote. We speak of an act by a sycophant, an evil man, a man poor in understanding, the most mediocre of men. This man, Hertz Vesely of Berlin, has addressed an epistle to those of the house of Israel who dwell in the land of His Majesty the Emperor. This epistle, called Words of Peace and Truth, makes one's heart heavy. It consists of 8 chapters of bootlicking, and deeming himself unique in his generation, he offers his rash advice to wise, understanding, perfect and flawless men. The gist of his insolent remarks is that since His Majesty the Emperor commanded the Israelites to establish schools to teach their youth the German language and to educate them to do mighty deeds in all areas of knowledge, that he, this worthless man, will extend counsel to fulfill His Majesty the Emperor's wishes. And then he goes on to tell us how this guy, Naftali Hertz Weisel, doesn't know anything. He's an ignoramus, and you can't possibly take seriously what he has to say. What's of course ironic about this is that I mentioned a few moments ago that one of Naftali Hertz Weisel's books was a commentary on Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers. And who should have written a Haskama? Who should have written a glorifying commendation of this book to the wider world than our friend Rabbi David Ben Nathan of Lisa? So when Naftali Hertz Weisel wrote what he approved of, he thought very highly. This rabbi thought very highly of Naftali Hertz Weisel, but in this case, he couldn't tolerate what he had to say because he saw what he had to say as dangerous and as undermining. I'm going to break now. and invite your questions. And Rabbi Bernard, I trust you will be the facilitator of that.
As a reminder, if you want to ask a question, click on Participants at the bottom of the screen and then on Raise Hand. Arthur.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. My question is, you said he wrote this document in Hebrew.
Yes.
Who could read it?
Ah.
I mean, not only who were the people who could understand what he was saying?
Right. So he clearly was writing this for educated Jews, and that it very much obviously included rabbis. But he wrote it also for this circle of Enlightenment thinkers. Right after this part of the question period, I'll start talking about the Haskalah movement, and to kind of anticipate what I will tell you about the Haskalah movement. The German Haskalah movement, and that was true of other Haskalah movements, which I'll talk about yet, wrote in the Hebrew language. I will tell you about how that was ironic in some senses, but that was the language that they used. Now, what's underlying your question is, could the masses of Jews understand this document? And frankly, I don't know the answer to that question. Are there any other questions?
Elaine and Charlie.
Charlie in this case, thank you. So the implication of what he wrote, if I understood it, is that this kind of human knowledge, the secular knowledge, would benefit only non-Jews. But it seems to exclude the notion of providing non-religious benefits to the Jewish community, sanitation or whatever. Is that intentional, or is that just a language thing?
Right. So that's a great question. I remind you that he did say that it would benefit Jews in their study of Torah. Now, you're raising another question, which is, what about in other ways too? He didn't venture into that area. Now, it may be that he was trying to limit the damage. In other words, in the sense of not antagonizing the rabbis too much. Or it may be that, in fact, Naftali Herz-Weisel was actually a very traditional Jew. And there was a limit to how far he was prepared to go with this argument. The truth of the matter is that this particular document that we're talking about is the most radical document that the man ever wrote. And then he continued to write as a traditional Jew, writing rabbinic commentaries, and as if he had never written this before. So it's not clear what his motivation was in holding back, which is what your question is.
One minute.
Ros?
Okay. Hi. Yes, hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. The very first thing you wrote about Naftali Herz-Weisel was he did say that first the children should be taught the fear of God and then go on to the other subjects. And I wondered, do you think he was trying to kowtow to the more religious people, or what do you think of that? Yes.
Yeah, no, that from everything that we know about him, I'll repeat, he was a traditional Jew. And he was not looking for a reform of Judaism. That was not on his mind at all, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And so I think that he was sincere in what he was saying about instilling a fear of God, because that certainly is part of the early education of children. But then the issue becomes, how do you balance these two different Torahs, right? And what's the relationship between them? And that's where he made these radical statements. I hope that you're all admiring the bookcase that I have behind me and how perfectly organized the books are. It's not in my house.
Betsy.
Any other questions at this point?
Is that
Betsy?
me? Oh, yeah, sure. I have a question about this word anterior. Is
Yes.
he saying that so-called human knowledge or man's knowledge is before God's knowledge? That puzzled me.
It ought to be taught first. That's correct. In other words, first you teach human knowledge to children, and then you teach the Torah of God. And yes, that now you understand why there were rabbis who reacted so strongly against him. Okay. And just to kind of skip ahead to where I hope we'll end up today, just thinking about the kind of Jewish education that we provide today, and the ideal being both at the same time, right? But even there are all kinds of issues about how much of each, how much time devoted to each. Maybe one more, because then I'd like to move on.
Linda?
The more I listen to you talking about this tension between the two, the human knowledge and the Torah knowledge,
Yes.
I can only think of the issues that Israel has with the ultra-Orthodox, who are saying no, Torah knowledge is all we need, and who are being pushed into human knowledge. So I just kept on thinking about that.
Good. I'm glad, because that's where we're going to end up today. Not only with the ultra-Orthodox Haredim, but we're going to also end up with today and other groups of Jews also today. I'd like to push on, and I will be breaking again twice for further questions, but I'd like to now situate our friend Naftali Hertzweisel into the Jewish context of his time. And as I've noted several times, he was a maskil, that meaning an individual who was part of the Jewish Enlightenment movement. The Jewish Enlightenment movement developed first in Germany in the 1770s and the 1780s. The foremost individual associated with that is Moses Mendelson, who lived in Berlin, and the circle around him and people who worked with him, including in translating the Bible into German, were instrumental in promoting the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement. And then the Enlightenment movement, the Haskalah, moved eastward. By the teens and the 20s of the 19th century, it moved into Galicia, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the Habsburg Empire. Galicia as in Galicianer, yes. And then in the middle decades of the 19th century, and even a bit beyond, it moved into Russia, where there were Russian maskilim. And they shared, all these maskilim, all these Jewish Enlightenment figures shared certain commonalities. And I want to briefly just speak about those commonalities, and then ask you to think about how he, Naftali Hertzweisel, fits into this. So in terms of those commonalities, first of all, they were concerned about reforming the Jews. They were not involved in reforming Judaism. This is not Reform Judaism we're talking about, but reforming the Jews. And by reforming the Jews, what I'm referring to is the extent to which they were interested in changing the education of young children, and also ensuring that Jews would become much more productive members of society. Now, what was driving all this? Here I hearken back to those three different groups that I spoke about earlier, all of whom disapproved of the Jews as they were now. And they came up with different ways of addressing the Jewish question. But all of them disapproved of the Jews as they were now. And what the Haskalah individuals did, the maskilim did, was they internalized the criticism of these intellectuals and government officials. They internalized them and believed what was being said. Not necessarily that the Jews stank, but that there was something wrong with the Jews. And we have to try to fix what's wrong with the Jews. There's a lot that's been written about what happens when a child grows up in an environment where the child is constantly told, you're bad. There's something wrong with you. how dangerous that is to convey to a child, because children internalize that criticism and come to the conclusion there's something wrong with me. Well, I'm projecting this on a much wider screen now. There were Jews who kept on hearing that Jews are being criticized. Everybody's telling us there's something wrong with us. There must be something wrong with us. And we have to try to fix it. And if we fix it, then those groups within society that are prepared to rethink the way in which they treat Jews, they will take further strides towards ameliorating our condition. In other words, they're reaching Christian Wilhelm Dohm, whom I mentioned earlier, who said, yes, the Jews are rotten the way they are, but it's no wonder that they're rotten because of the way we treat them. Well, we ought to reach our hand out to them, said the Maskilim, to people like Christian Wilhelm Dohm, and say, look, we understand what you're saying. We are prepared to improve ourselves because we know in response to that, you will further improve our condition and lift some of the restrictions upon us. So they saw it as a reciprocal kind of activity. And the Maskilim were cockeyed optimists. They believed that if the Jews would just get it right, then everything would improve for the Jews, including the disappearance of anti-Semitism. So they were optimistic. And it's easy to poke fun at them, but I remind you that they were living at the beginning of an era of change, where medieval restrictions seemed to be falling by the wayside, and there was hope that more of those restrictions would continue to fall by the wayside. So what I've already said to you about the Maskilim is that they were optimists, that they were trying to demonstrate to society that Jews could become much more useful, and they were hopeful that over the course of time, the Jewish situation would evolve in a positive direction. They were not revolutionaries. That comes in Russia at the end of the 19th century, when Jews finally gave up on the Haskalah and decided to become revolutionaries, or decided on a different course of revolutionary action. They became Zionists, and they said, let's get the heck out of here, because nothing's going to improve otherwise. But that's 100 years later that we're talking about, more than 100 years later. What else did these Jews want to do, the Maskilim? They wanted to get Jews to be more productive citizens, and that meant that they wanted Jews to become farmers, to work in agriculture. Now, not their own children, of course, but other Jews' children should become farmers, right? And the notion that if we only would work with our hands, that would improve the situation because we demonstrate how productive we can be. So sure enough, this idea eventually had an afterlife, didn't it? Isn't that what some of the Zionists promoted also, when they took physicians who made Aliyah and turned them into chicken farmers? Because that's much more productive. They're working with their hands, after all, right? That was an idea that, again, was internalized by these Maskilim, that there was something wrong with the Jews. All this business that we're doing, we are Luftmenschen, we're floating in the air. We have to ground ourselves, we have to work with our hands. That's the way to go. Now again, I said before, your children, not necessarily my children, ought to work with their hands. So that was another part of the Haskalah program. And then, as I mentioned earlier in response to one of the questions, they wrote in Hebrew. And here comes the irony. Why do they write in Hebrew? They wrote in Hebrew in part because Enlightenment individuals regarded Hebrew as a classical language. And they regarded the language that was spoken, the vernacular that was spoken by the Jews of Germany and of the Habsburg Empire, the language which we know as Yiddish, they regarded that as a jargon, a backward language, a mishmash. This comes later in the 19th century. The famous German writer and poet Goethe described Yiddish as the language of dogs. And so the Maskilim wanted to rid the Jews of Yiddish, and so they wrote in the Hebrew language because it was a more elite language, and it was a respectable language. But the irony was that they were trying to convince Jews in Hebrew to learn German. Why is that ironic? Because the more the Maskilim succeeded, the less people would be able to read what they wrote. And that's exactly what happened. There's a famous poem that was written by the most famous Russian maskilim, Yehuda Leib Gordon, who wrote a poem about, am I going to be the last singer of Hebrew? Am I going to be the last person who will understand Hebrew? I've convinced you so well to study Russian in this case, or German, that you can't read Hebrew anymore. Therefore, you can't read my poetry. So that was the kind of the irony that was built into the Haskalah program. But I want to just emphasize that there was an element of supreme naivete to their outlook, but I, for one, try to put myself in their situation and to appreciate that they were at the beginning of a process. We know certainly the European end to this story, and they could not know that. They were optimistic. Now, I promised you the opportunity to ask questions, but I want to go on and get to the last part, and then we'll open it up to questions again. So I've tried to situate Naftali Herz-Weisel then in the context of this Haskalah movement. But I've also stressed that he was on the conservative end of this spectrum, even though this pamphlet introduced some radical ideas. So now my final question for you is, does this have any pertinence to us today? And Linda, in her question, already noted that the brains are working, and you can see that this has relevance to the present day. And has relevance in different ways. Certainly, there continue to be Jews who believe, and especially religious leaders who believe, that Torat Ha'adam needs to be approached very cautiously and only in a very limited, constrained fashion. That what we need to teach our young Jews today is Torat Hashem, the Torah of God. And we only need to introduce them to the Torat Ha'adam for the basics that they may need to function in a very rudimentary fashion in society. There are extreme examples of this. I have been to Satmar schools in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, where you walk the hallways, as I did, and all you hear are the kids during their break chattering to each other in Yiddish. And English is taught as a second language. These are kids who were born and bred in Brooklyn. So that's part of the mindset. Having said that, and then the question is also, to what extent do they learn more sophisticated skills that will enable them to participate in an advanced economy, such as the economy of the United States, or, to use Linda's example, the economy of Israel, which is also a modern, advanced technological economy. These are very serious questions. You may know that there is an organization founded by a man who was educated in a Haredi school, who has sued New York City for permitting schools in New York City run by Hasidim to deny the opportunity of children to learn more sophisticated subjects, whether it's math or whether it's the sciences, whether it's the technology about the use of computers. And so this organization has sued New York City. And I just read yesterday that Mr. de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, has played footsie with rabbis and basically quashed efforts to investigate what's really going on in those schools. I don't want to present a one-sided picture of this story, though, because I'm familiar with a scholar at Yeshiva University, which is a modern Orthodox institution. And this scholar has written some articles about how, yes, it's true that they're not exposed to these advanced topics, but they're given the tools to think critically and to quickly absorb information. And frankly, I have witnessed this. I've had a lot of dealings through my research with Chabad rabbis, for example, and I'm stunned by how sophisticated they can be in the way they go about doing their business, which to my mind is much more sophisticated than any other movements. And none of them has attended college. They know how to learn what they need to learn. So, and that's the point of this scholar issue university, that they have the basic thinking skills that they can then absorb this information. Is that enough? Obviously, I don't think so, because I didn't educate my own children that way. But then there's the other side of the story, and that is, well, what about the balance between Torat Hadam and Torat Hashem? To what extent are we really balancing those out? Well, in Jewish day schools, there's an attempt that's made to find some sort of balance. Modern Orthodox schools strive for a 50-50 balance, as opposed to Haredi schools, which at best strive for a 90-10 balance or an 80-20 balance. And then in other Jewish day schools, Schechter schools try to maintain a 60-40 balance, 60% devoted to general studies, 40% to Jewish studies. Community day schools very often only devote 20% of the day to Jewish studies. What I'm trying to point out to you is that we haven't quite figured out how to balance these two either. I don't know of schools that really take this approach, that you start with Torat Hadam and then you move to Torat Hashem. Certainly, we haven't licked this particular dilemma ourselves to the present day. So what Naftali Herz-Weisel began to struggle with in the 1780s, here we are over 240 years later, and we're not doing all that much better in terms of resolving exactly how we should negotiate the balance between Torat Hadam and Torat Hashem. With that, I'm happy to conclude. I'll be more than happy to take your questions.
Leonard?
Yes, thank you very much for your for an interesting hour. I want to go back to the 18th century and ask about whether there wasn't, if a minority view, but whether there wasn't another view of the Jews. And I'm thinking of great work by Bernard Picard from the early 18th century. You're familiar with it, I assume?
Yes, yes.
Of course, in which, from early 18th century, it was a runaway bestseller. Every year there was another edition, et cetera,
Right.
believed to have been read by the European elites. The first volume of which, of course, is about the Jews and represents the Jews, in this case, the Jews of Amsterdam, as normal people. Of course, there's been a book written about this, The Book That Changed Europe, by Lynn Hunt and others. And so was the view of the Jews as stinking and so on as universal as you presented it?
Right.
Was there not already a shift, a cultural shift that had taken place over the course of the Enlightenment decades, which viewed the Jews more humanly,
Yes,
like everyone else?
right. That's certainly a fair question. In that, of course, there were Enlightenment figures who did make the case for much more toleration of all people, for that matter. The question is, to what extent were their views internalized in the geographic area of our focus, in the German-speaking lands and the Habsburg Empire? Were they read? I don't know enough about Picard and the extent to which his works were read, but what I was describing and reflecting was the extent to which government officials were writing about the Jews. Yes, there was change afoot, and your point is very helpful for us, because again, these Jewish Enlightenment figures were latching on to precisely those rays of hope in the form of other individuals who were speaking more positively. Let's give these people more ammunition to demonstrate that we can change, and therefore the governments ought to change their policies.
Gary?
So the question of Torah Hashem education in isolation, I think also raises the question of, of the motivation of economic assimilation and economic engagement of the Jewish population.
Yes.
And it also, I think, was recognized as a problem if you were not able to work, right? To work as part of the society around you. And I think that you can trace that back to Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, verse 2, where it basically says it is good to join the study of Torah to some kind of work for the effort required by both robs sin of its power. That's from Rabban Gamliel, the son of Gamliel III, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. But there's the Musar movement that came about, I think, because of a concern about isolation and the restriction to Torah Hashem only. And then Maimonides also, made a point about combining work, sleep, and Torah study in equal proportions. So, right. I'm wondering whether there's something unique about the European environment and at that point in time that made it contentious.
Sure. Well, the issue, I appreciate your question. So first of all, the issue was not whether Jews are working. They had to work in order to earn a living. But the question had to do with what kind of work were they doing, and were they doing productive work? And look, we have this kind of critique to the present day. Some of the criticism directed at Mr. Soros, as an example, who's very sharply critiqued in some European countries and anti-Semitic circles and so on. Again, what does he do? He pushes money around. He speculates, right? So that was the kind of the sentiment also. To what extent are the Jews being useful people? And you also are correct in saying that it's not as if these issues had never arisen before. There were Jews, especially in certain environments, where it was more feasible and also advantageous to interact with some of the wider culture. But yes, to come back to your main question now, something was happening in Europe, and that's what I focused on today. In that period of time, there were debates that were happening. What shall we do with the Jews? How shall we treat them? How shall we reorder our society? And how do Jews fit into that? So that prompted, these political debates prompted the emergence of this issue as a major issue.
Kurt?
Yes, I wanted to ask, it's one thing to try and balance Torat Hadam and Torat Hashem, but I'm wondering, how do we teach our kids how to show how Torat Hadam and Torat Hashem cohere with one another or don't cohere, and how and where they do or don't?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a question that, if I may use this word, bedevils Jewish education. It comes under the rubric of integration. To what extent can we integrate these studies? I can tell you that there are schools of different types, whether they're Jewish day schools or congregational schools or other types of settings, that struggle with these issues and try to integrate in various ways. But it's that too is an ongoing dilemma to the present day.
So I'm going to draw us to an official end. I don't know, Professor Wertheimer, if you're able to stay on for more questions, but for those who need to go now, which may include you, I wanted to officially end the session. What Kurt just said is exactly what I've been thinking about this whole time. And parents of children in Jewish day schools right now are getting this up close view of their learning in a way that we never have. And what's been so striking to me is none of that learning is happening in the communal environment of the school. So all of that integration, right, the writing and the math and the English reading that happens in the context of a Jewish community infused with all kinds of rhythms and values of Jewish life is missing. And it's fascinating to me to see this sort of atomized attempt, which I think is very hard really for any school to pull off, of doing pieces of both of these priorities without the opportunity to integrate them. So I think it's a whole other fascinating dimension of what you've shared with us. But thank you for this really really informative and, no pun intended, enlightening history that really does shed light on what we're dealing with today. I want to just also make sure people are aware of our session next week, which keeps us in the modern period. Our current provost, Dr. Shuli Schwartz, will be teaching next Monday, the 18th. Her session is called Fake News and the Resurgence of Anti-Semitism. And the truth is she's really looking at ancient and later roots of anti-Semitism, and the kind of exploring whether anti-Semitism today, which Professor Wertheimer just started to get at, in what ways that's rooted in historical and really ancient anti-Semitism. So that's what we'll be doing next week. So I want to again thank Professor Wertheimer and all of you for joining us. We wish you a great week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Do we have time for a few more questions?
I have the time, yeah, but I need you to chair, coordinate. Yep. Yeah.
Hello?
Hi, Robert. Robert?
Yeah, me, Robert. Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, just questioning the term Haskalah Maskilim, based obviously on the word sechel, good, common sense, knowledge. Was that a term they said of themselves, or was that a term later applied to them?
I don't know the answer to that question at the moment. Sorry. They were often called the Ma'asfim also because they contributed to a journal called Ma'asef. So I'm not sure.
Betty?
Hello? Hello?
Hello?
Go ahead, Betty.
Me?
Yes.
Okay, so I just wondered if what you were quoting from was so out of character to all of the other things that you describe him as writing, are we 100% sure that he is actually the one who wrote it, or is it possible that somebody who wanted to bring attention to the Haskalah wrote it in his name?
It's clear that you were a revisionist, but I haven't come across anybody who suggested otherwise. He circulated this to a circle of people, and they were familiar with it, and there's no reason to think that that somebody stole his name, his identity, as happens today.
Melvin?
Hi. Hi,
How you doing, Mel?
Okay.
Now they're calling on the troublemakers.
That's right. Save this for later. Jack, my understanding was that many of the early great sages of our tradition had trades in addition to their Jewish scholarship and considered that a virtue, and in fact it's preached in some of their writings.
Yes.
We have other great examples. You could enumerate more than I could. Obviously, the Rambam, being a highly skilled physician, had a big enough mind, let's say, to be able to learn and practice those skills and do everything he did in Jewish scholarship. And now we find in 1780, preaching the notion of Jews working with their hands as being a new idea. And in fact, some of the ultra-Orthodox traditions of which you spoke seem to disdain that, to the extent that it's considered a great mitzvah to spend more than full time exclusively on Torah studies, and somehow the parnasa will come from, noble Jews who are willing to support this. You don't have an obligation to do this through your own skills or the use of your mind in other ways than application to Torah. So I'm wondering about the evolution. And by the way, this also in a mega sense is a huge socio-economic problem in Israeli society, that there's a big segment of the society which is essentially on the dole because of
Right, yeah. Your question opens up kind of a large question about the economics of the whole thing, and certainly a number of these Haskalah figures, in fact, were businessmen, and they were men of means. They tended to live in urban centers, and that's where this culture was being produced. So no, they themselves were involved, but they were not working with their hands. They were business people. They were running factories. They traded. And as I suggested about Naftali Hertz Weisel, he came from a family of means and was himself a business person. So their attitude towards work was the need to be productive, and that's what they were most concerned about: getting Jews to be productive, but productive in different ways than had been the case in the Middle Ages, and breaking out of the straitjacket of Jewish occupations that they had been limited to, the Jews had been limited to during the Middle Ages. Mel, you're looking good.
Robert?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things that you didn't bring up, but I think is a big driver to this whole thing of a need for change and even the Enlightenment is the Industrial Revolution. There's, like you mentioned, there's factories coming on board, there's changes in the economy, and as long as Jews would stay in the shtetl and not be affected, they're going to be left behind by the enormous changes that are happening in the greater society. So it seems like that's a big reason why the Jews said, look, we don't want to be left behind. We'll be stuck in poverty for eternity unless we make some of the changes that we need to make to adjust to the new conditions.
Right. The only caution I would offer you is that the Industrial Revolution came later to areas where there was a Haskalah. In other words, Germany was not industrializing yet in the 1780s. That comes later in the 19th century. And the same can be said also in other parts of Europe as the Haskalah moved progressively eastward. So I'm not aware that the Maskilim were preoccupied with the Industrial Revolution, how that was affecting them. I'm linking this movement much more to political developments that were occurring and the attempt to rationalize the functioning of the state and then figuring out how different populations in the state ought to fit in. And as I tried to note several times, not only the place of Jews was being reconsidered in that period of time. But yes, this concern about Jews being left behind, again, that resonates to the present day also, as has been said, the extent to which large portions of Israel's population, between the Haredim and the Arab populations, to what extent are they being sufficiently trained to function in a highly technological society? Although I must tell you that I recently read about Haifa University. I think the figure was something 50% of the students at Haifa University are Israeli Arabs, and they are making enormous strides. So change is occurring. And by the way, similar things are occurring in the Haredi community, more so in the United States than in Israel, where you have some sectors of the Haredi community attending universities and getting advanced degrees. So change is afoot.
Susan?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor, for your wonderful lecture. I'm a Presbyterian pastor, student of Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, and I've been translating Ecclesiastes for the last 7 or 8 months, and I'm up to chapter 9. And this morning, I translated verse 16 of 9. Then said I, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. And I couldn't help but think as I heard you talk the language of the article as well, under the sun. It just kept coming back over and over again. What would be the scholarship connecting the author of the article on Ecclesiastes?
Well, I'm just picking up on under the sun. Again, the sun, light, enlightenment. These were images that were commonly used by Enlightenment figures.
I see.
And we're, as a metaphor for what's happening in the intellectual realm, and then from there the political realm, that we're going through a period of change, but it's a positive change also. That comes back to the optimism. Thanks for tuning in.
Ezra?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful material.
Thank you.
In looking at this article, I wonder to whom it was written or for whom it was written, because it sounds like, if I read it in the way, if it were a modern, currently written paper, I would think of it as a political effort to bring the emperor into wanting the Jews more than any other motivation. Just wondering what you think about it, because it's such a politically focused kind of unspoken but politically focused piece.
Right, right. I don't know whether Naftali Hertzweisel had the hope that his pamphlet in Hebrew would be translated for the emperor. I think that he was looking for an indirect pipeline to the emperor, in the sense of, if we can get the Jews to change their ways, then the emperor will take notice of that, and then more and better changes will come. The focus of the Maskilim was primarily upon a Jewish audience, hence their writing in Hebrew, rather. Moses Mendelson wrote in German, and he was writing for a wider audience of intellectuals with only limited success. But similar issues were being raised by other Maskilim to try to get the Jews to get their act together in a different way. Thank you.
Howard?
Thank you, and thanks for this wonderful talk. The time period that you've talked about overlaps exactly with the time period of the Vilna Gaon. And often the Vilna Gaon and the Vilna school of scholarship are seen in contrast to the Maskilim, and yet the Vilna Gaon studied geometry and astronomy and grammar and other secular subjects. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about whether this has been sort of a false dichotomy set up, and whether there in fact was some sort of similar movement in the Eastern Europe, particularly in Vilna, at the same time.
Right. So when Rabbi Andelman introduced me, she said the focus of my research is on post-World War II American Jewry. So this topic area, which I've blundered into, is not my area of greatest strength. So therefore, I need to be modest about responding to your question. Excuse me, but I have done reading on this period, and to the best of my knowledge, the Vilna Gaon, who you accurately said did employ various studies and was in his own work much more interested in this area. To the best of my knowledge, he never promoted that to others, never encouraged others to pursue this, certainly never came up with a program, as Naftali Hertzweisel did, of actually ensuring that the educational system will change so that the masses of Jews will be exposed to a very different type of knowledge. In other words, this was for elites, right? The rabbinic elites, we can trust them that they know the truth, and they will be kept on the right course, so they can afford to venture into those areas. But as for the masses of Jews, people like the Vilna Gaon, I don't think, had that confidence.
Howard?
That was me. I already asked that question.
Paul?
Next person.
Paul, are you there? Let's go on to Lisa.
Hi, thank you so much for your inspiration, and I do love your library.
Good. You're welcome to have any book you want.
Yeah. So I have a question and then also more of a comment. So first, my comment, I'm finding a connection between Jewish students being taught the laws before the prayers and Adam Torah. I'm wondering if you see a connection or if it's, you know, worth delving into a little bit more. Are you understanding my connection?
No, maybe you can spell it out a little bit more.
Okay, so I understand that most of the Jewish students, the young people, are taught the laws of Torah before they're taught the prayers. At least in Southeast Wisconsin, that's how it is.
Really?
So, yeah. So I'm just wondering if Adam Torah, if there's kind of a connection with that, being taught the laws, which, you know, attorneys and so forth need to be educated in.
Right. You're talking about the present day, right? Right. So I suspect that what's going on is that, for better or worse, I think for worse, many Jewish schools are giving up on teaching the prayers. It's very hard to get children to relate to prayers. Young children actually can relate much better. But as kids progress, especially into puberty, this becomes a crisis. I once spoke with a Jewish educator who described trying to organize prayer for middle school students as his Vietnam. It's just so difficult to do. It's a losing fight. And so I think that what happens is that the focus is then much more on rituals. Let me describe these rituals to you, because there's something to discuss there and to sink our teeth into. Prayers is much more difficult. I don't think it's related to Torah Ta'adam, though. Okay.
Sherry?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay. I was actually going to say something a little earlier, but unfortunately I had disconnected from the meeting, so I apologize if I'm going back a little too far. But I want to address something that's more on the visceral level about what's going on. Whether it's masculine towards everyone else, because basically it's an elitist attitude towards, if you will, the common folk. But you still see some of the same thing going on now. And it actually carries with it its own inbuilt antagonism. Because the fact of the matter is, one looks down, one patronizes the people to whom you're trying to reach. Mm-hmm. And what's even worse is, if you're on the pulpit speaking that way, you're doing more than that. Maybe the adults or those of the age of whomever is speaking can understand why it's being said. But the children in that group are the ones who are growing up and hearing this. They don't have any idea of the knowledge that went into the view expressed. So what do they get is basically an unthinking, I can't think of the right word, but it's kind of a joking attitude, whether it's towards another movement, right, or towards another idea, because they hear the criticism without knowing the knowledge behind the criticism.
Right.
That's the
yeah. I hear your question about kind of the, if you will, the tone of the way in which people speak, and I'd like to believe that there's no question in my mind that was much more common in a past generation. I'd like to believe that much of that has dissipated, in part because educators and rabbis and others have realized that that's the best way to turn people off, and there's much more of a need to speak to people in their in their own language, and rather than from a haughty point of view. Whether some people continue to do that, I can't vouch for that. I wouldn't be surprised that you've encountered some of that. But yes, there's a kind of feeling tone here as well. Again, the response of a Naftali Herz-Weisel would be, no, I'm trying to help the people. I'm trying to talk about an education that's going to benefit their children. So it can be read in different ways.
Hi. I have a different kind of question that occurred to me, and I realize it's sweeping historical. But when you were talking about the response, which was basically an internalization of external criticism.
Yes.
We, the Jewish community, if we change, if we wash, if we this,
Mm-hmm.
it'll get better.
Yes.
And I thought about all the way back to, and I never know how to pronounce this word, the epispasm, the reversing of circumcision, you know, that period of time where Jews thought, oh, it's going to work if we assimilate to the Romans. And even now, this is you said this is the troublemaker example of, if you look at the American left saying, all Israel has to do is stop settlements, do this, whatever, there'll be peace. Has there ever been a time that you can think of where Jews facing anti-Semitism, I mean, maybe I should ask this next week, but facing anti-Semitism, all this criticism said, no, it's not us, it's you?
Well, yeah, so I think that's occurred in many periods, and it's occurring in our own period also. There are exceptions, which is what seemed to, these exceptions are bothering you, and I think understandably so. I think that rather than focus on those exceptions and kind of berating them, it might be useful to understand where they're coming from, in the sense of what are they reacting to, and how powerful it is when the larger society frowns down upon Jews and points a finger of blame at the Jews, or as in this case, the case of Israel, that it's all you're doing. The extent to which there will be Jews who will internalize that and say, oh, there must be something wrong with us. And that, I'm glad you're raising this, because there is this element to the Haskalah of being quick to assume blame for what Jews are really not responsible for. In fairness, I recommend that you take a look at the document. You'll see that Naftali Herz-Weisel rejects that point of view. And he said, no, this was not our fault. And that anti-Semitism is not our fault, but there's still things that we can do. So Naftali, I don't put it in this category of just internalizing everything in an unquestioning fashion.
Hi, I wanted to ask about the relationship between Hasidism and Haskalah. They would seem antithetical. Is it a casual relationship or a causal relationship?
Well, as one of the people who raised the question before noted, that actually the Haskalah in Germany arose at the exact same time as Hasidism did in Eastern Europe. I'm not aware really of any connection between the two of them at the time. By the time the Haskalah moves into Galicia, and certainly into Russia, there is fierce antagonism between the two. The Hasidim controlled the printing houses, and they tried to censor and stamp out the publication of Haskalah works. And Haskalah works were viciously critical of rabbis. That you don't see in the German Haskalah, and certainly not in Divrei Shalom ve'emet. He's not critical of the rabbis in this document. But that became a characteristic of the Haskalah in Eastern Europe, which ridiculed and was quite antagonistic towards the rabbis, and vice versa. These were bitter foes.
I think that's it for today.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate your staying longer, and you all get extra credit for that. And it's been a pleasure being with you. And thank you, Tim.
Thanks, Professor Wertheimer. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.